What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 134 days now, going all the way up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through how mapping the customer journey ultimately leads to the system blueprint that lays the foundation for how you think and approach that entire customer journey from your first touch point to the last touch point. So then today we're going to be going through essentially the core problem, how we're basically going to be mapping out this core problem, as well as my core framework, how I'm actively thinking about this and my approach to this and solving this. Then we're going to be moving into the system mapping, an example of the system mapping and how this system works, so that you can have an overview in terms of how the key interactions are ultimately are. And then we're going to go into the final outcome, what comes as a result from this. So if we jump straight into the core problem, we can see that most businesses build backwards. And what this basically means is that they start with the tools and then try force them onto their customer journey, but not realizing that their customer journey is unique and not all tools are ultimately going to serve the purpose that they ultimately need for their specific customer journey. And understanding that customer journey is super important. And this is why this is why it's simply because their automations feel clunky. Simply, they have these automations, but they ultimately don't feel like they're as smooth as they can be and efficient as well. So that means that data gets lost within the different touch points, because there is multiple different touch points that ultimately happen throughout this customer journey, from someone booking a call to then having to get their fulfillment done, and then having a survey and then having the survey after that. And that ultimately means that clients fall through the cracks as a result of this, because they don't realize that their system should mirror the journey and not dictate it. And what this ultimately means is that the business should build their customer journey around, or their systems around, this specific customer journey, and not dictate the flow of it based off of the tools that they're using. And this ultimately means that the way that I like to approach it is through inflows, processes, and outflows, and understanding how these ultimately interact with each other as well. And this we can look by the inflows by solely just taking a look at how the inflows operate, and this is how the users enter. This is basically their traffic source awareness or opt-in. How do the users actively come in? And understanding that from this input or this inflow, we ultimately take this inflow and then move it across the different flow states, which are basically your process. And understanding how this process flow goes, we see that everything that happens on the back end, everything that no one ever sees externally, but the things that happen internally, such as your ops, delivery, and feedback loops that you're ultimately running as a result of this. This means that the automations, the processes that you've built internally ultimately happen within the process flow, and that ultimately leads to the outflow. And this outflow is what people see on the outside, and this is what the value, and this is basically what value exits the systems, which are ultimately your reports, your upsells, or your referrals. And this ultimately leads you to understanding that through these different stages, there are different things that happen from your inflows. Where are the traffic sources coming from? Are they coming from email opt-ins? Are they coming from surveys? Are they coming from different awareness levels that you've ultimately been able to build? How are they actively entering our ecosystem, and how is the process flow also interacting with them as well? And this is what happens internally, what no one ever sees on the outside, but ultimately happens as a result of the mechanisms that you've built internally as the business, which ultimately translates into the outflows, which is where the value ultimately exits, in the sense that you have your reports, so saying, hey, we've had these specific metrics that we've gained from having this client on or has come into our ecosystem, and this is a result of what they've ultimately given to this system. And also understanding that one of the core things that I like to ask around this is through each stage ultimately understanding three questions, and asking these three questions, which is ultimately asking what process repeats here, basically understanding where the process ultimately repeats, because we can then identify where this process repeats, and and through that identification we can then recognize patterns that we can then use to further enhance how we're actively approaching the customer journey, as well as asking what decisions ultimately happen here and understanding each and every stage, what decisions ultimately need to be made, also allows us to have a deeper understanding, in the sense that we can also then document the decisions that we've ultimately taken at each different stage, so that we can then use it further to ultimately refine how we're ultimately building this customer journey around our customers, or these systems around our customers. Sorry, I'm mixing up the customer journey with the systems, because it's ultimately building the system around the customer journey rather than having it dictate how the customer journey ultimately flows. And that means also asking, what data moves through here, which is one of the most important questions that I like to ask as well. What data ultimately flows here? Is it leads? Is it what kind of metrics are we also tracking as well through the different stages? For example, if we look at the inflows, are we tracking how much traffic signs the opt-in page or opts in, or are we moving towards the process flow where we're basically tracking how much time does it take to ultimately deliver on fulfillment, or how much time does it take to ultimately have feedback as well, as how are our operations functioning, are our triggers firing on time and allowing us to smoothen our process so that we can have a fast turnaround, or even just looking at the outflows where we basically take a look at what are the upsells, like what are the metrics in regards to the upsells. Are people opting in to get the upsell, or are they referring us as well? And also ultimately tracking what data ultimately flows across these different phases as well, because if you're then able to understand how these different data how the different data flows across these different states, you're then able to predict how you can move into the future, and how the data also functions as your somewhat navigation in how you're ultimately building this customer journey. Because if you're flying blind, you're not ultimately going to know what works in terms of the customer journey, and also understanding what fails as well. Because if you ultimately don't understand what works and what fails, then you're not going to be able to enhance on this specific customer journey and build your systems around that as well. But then we can ultimately look into an example of how this ultimately works. And this example goes as follows. Your typical your typical a lead books a call, and from that call your lead ultimately gets auto, or a deal gets auto created inside the CRM. So this is, for example, saying, hey, this person has ultimately booked a call, and that ultimately filters into sending messages on Slack, or even your different tools that you may be using. And that ultimately means that you're then getting after the call, you're then having this process where you then have the call as a result of that. So then this is what happens after the call, and this is designing the journey that so that it's super tailored to the entire customer journey and is specific as well. And this means that after the call, you're then able to auto update the status to, so basically to say, hey, this person has signed on as a client, and this task needs to be created specifically for operations, so that operations ultimately understands, hey, this is what this specific client needs, and this is how they work as well, such that we can ultimately build a system around that, and also refine the process as well, and understanding how the different data flows through these different phases. For example, if we look at how the lead books the call, we can track, hey, how many leads are actively booking the call, and how is the drop off from filling the survey, whatever medium you may be using. Say you're using a survey, so how does that survey ultimately populate the data inside the deal that is created? Are we able to capture enough data that ultimately gives us context, so that when the sales person hops on the call, they ultimately understand and have that context as to where their current state is, and ultimately ask the right questions on the call? And that ultimately means that we're also tracking the update status, and understanding how this different data flows through these different stages as well, such that we can then start fulfillment, and then understand, hey, this is where we're ultimately starting fulfillment. How long are these feedback loops, in terms of client engagement, and engagement from the entire team, from ops to sales, and how that ultimately moves towards the fulfillment for the specific client. And as a result of that, auto triggering onboarding, so that they ultimately ultimately understand that, hey, this onboarding sequence has ultimately started and we request documents. So say, hey, we need to request documents from the specific client to say, hey, like, thanks for onboarding, this is what we're going to need. That happens automatically, and that means that when the client finishes, auto surveys plus review requests are then ultimately made, such so that when we ultimately want to request different surveys, this specific part is here so that we can see that the client finishes over here, and then from there we're then able to gather surveys and review requests as well, such so that we can also just gather those data points that ultimately allow us to then understand at a far deeper level in terms of how our process is working, and as a result as well as how we're able to move and understand how the data moves across these different sections as well. And that ultimately means that each step ultimately equals a one journey node, and each of the nodes ultimately compound into one system component. And this means that we're building all of this in order to build one system component, such so that we understand how the customer journey ultimately interacts with each other, and also building a system around that so that we can ultimately build this system so that it's super tailored towards the customer journey, so that we're ultimately understanding how the different roles also interact with each other. And that ultimately means that we're having the outcome of understanding that when you map out this way, your systems stop breaking under pressure, because you've simply super tailored the systems to be able to handle the specific customer journey. And data integrity also improves across the different layers, simply because you've built systems around that are tailored to the specific customer journey and how this customer journey interacts as well with the people that are actively interacting with it as well, which is your team, your internal team that is also interacting with it as well. And this ultimately results in clients feeling carried and not managed. They ultimately understand what is the next step, and them understanding what the next step is crucial, because once clarity dissipates, then you're not going to be able to capture the full value in terms of their attention. And that also matters as well. It's always the small details that ultimately compound and play a role in terms of how the engagement ultimately is between your client and also you as well. And understanding that you can scale operations predictably, because you're then able to predict these different patterns that you've ultimately been able to gain through the different data points, in terms of understanding the data from a root core fundamental of saying, hey, this is how the data flows, these are the questions that we're also asking and also understanding as well. And that ultimately means that your customer experience is your system architecture. If you're then able to build your system or your customer journey around your systems, or your systems around your customer journey, then you're then able to capture the full amount of value that you possibly can, and also create insane amounts of value, because you super tailored your customer journey such so that your clients ultimately feel heard and not managed, that they can also be able to fully express how they ultimately move across this entire system. And that ultimately comes as a result of building out this entire system and fully understanding that building it around the customer journey enables you to scale predictably, and also create more value into the future, and not just today as well, but also into the future. And yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my newsletter that I recently just rolled out. And also, if you want to connect, make sure to check out X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.